So here's where we are in the process. In the last 2 weeks, you assessed your needs to determine the skills and knowledge you want your learners to acquire. Then you wrote an appropriate, feasible, and clearly stated instructional set of goals. After that, you analyzed the goals to identify sub-steps, subordinate skills, and entry behaviors. Finally, you analyzed the learners, the performance context, and the learning context. So the good news is that at this point, you're finished with the analysis phase of instructional design. The next step in systematic instructional design is to write a list of objectives for your goals based on all this information you've gathered so far. The objectives are then are carried over to the next stages of the process, and they're going to influence everything we do from here on. So the objectives are very important. A set of clear objectives will give you a sound basis for selecting and developing your instructional materials, as well as a means for evaluating whether your instruction's been successful. You can use them in your instruction as well to inform learners of what they will be expected to learn, because informing the learners of the objectives can help provide more learner control, and also it helps students link their new knowledge to what they already know, to their old knowledge. So what is an objective? A performance objective is a detailed description of what students will be able to do when they complete a unit of instruction. An objective does not describe what the instructor will be doing, but instead the skills, knowledge, and attitudes that the instructor will be attempting to produce in learners. This is a very important distinction. So we need to emphasize that we have a need for clear, precise statements of what students should be able to do when they complete their instruction. And this needs to be done before we can start developing, our actual learning modules. So objectives are derived from the skills you identified in the instructional analysis when you mapped out all of your goal statements. So generally, you should write one or more objectives for each skill listed in your instructional analysis. Objectives can be skills, intellectual or motor. It can be knowledge or attitudes. So you're probably a little confused. You're thinking, okay, we did goals, now we're doing objectives. So how does an objective compare to a goal statement? Well, the goal statement is a much broader statement of what students will be able to do after completing a set of instructional materials, and includes a real-world performance context outside of the learning situation. Remember, we talked about what the student would be able to do back when they return to work from this training. Objectives are much more specific and describes a context within the learning situation. So this is within your learning unit. And they are therefore better to use as a basis for planning the instructional activities. So if a goal statement is written in form of an objective, we call that a terminal objective. The terminal objective has all the components of a performance objective, but its conditions reflect the context that will be available in the learning environment as opposed to the performance environment that we talked about when we did goals. So that's the main difference there. It's a matter of the context. So according to Major, there are 3 main components of an effective objective. And this is what your objective always has to contain, always has to have these 3 things: performance, conditions, and criterion. So for performance, the performance component is a description of the behavior the learners are expected to perform. It has to be measurable and observable. It describes what the learner will be doing when demonstrating mastery of an objective. Okay, so Major, he's the researcher that defined this sort of thing, distinguished between 2 types of performances, visible and invisible. With a visible performance, the main intent is visible or audible. For example, something like be able to dance, be able to interview, be able to paint a picture of a mountain. In each of these instances, you can tell when somebody's performing a task. If a statement does not include a visible performance, then it isn't an objective. You have to have visible performance. Therefore, you need to modify each of your objectives until it answers the question, what will the learner be doing when demonstrating the achievement of the objective? So here's some really bad examples. You don't want to say, be able to understand math, develop an appreciation of music. If you apply the question to these, what would someone be doing if they were understanding math or appreciating music? There's really no way to tell, as both these statements described abstract states that are really not directly observable. Some good examples would be able to ride a bicycle, be able to write a letter. What would someone be doing if they were demonstrating mastery of these objectives? Like in the first case, they would be actually riding a bike. You would see that. In the second case, they would be writing a letter. So these are easily identifiable behaviors. And this is what you want for the performance part of your objective. So the conditions part of the objective. The conditions component is a description of the circumstances under which the performance is going to be carried out. So this includes a description of what will be available to learners when they perform the desired behavior. So specifying the conditions further helps to prevent misunderstanding of your intent. So for example, let's say you're given the objective, travel from New York to Washington, D.C. in 2 hours. And you think, okay, I probably could do that if I were on a plane. However, what if the objective is stated like this? Given an automobile, travel from New York to Washington, D.C. in 2 hours. Or using your own 2 feet, travel from New York to Washington, D.C. in 2 hours. So you can see where the conditions make that, not real achievable. So it's going to be, in both these cases, the conditions of the objectives make it clear what the intent is. So to avoid any confusion regarding your objective, you should state the main condition under which the performance will occur. So you need to ask yourself, what will the learners be expected to use when performing? What tools, forms, charts, etc.? What will the learner not be allowed to use while performing? Notes or checklists, calculators, whatever. What will the real-world conditions under which the performance will be expected to occur? Things like in front of a large audience, in a manufacturing plant, in an office, whatever, on board a ship, whatever it is. So here are some examples of conditions. Given a standard set of tools and a malfunctioning motor, so on and so forth. Using a metric ruler, so on and so forth. In the presence of an irate customer, so on and so forth. So you're setting that up, that the person is going to be, with a customer who's irate. So you kind of can get the idea. And here are some examples of objectives with conditions. Given a product and a prospective customer, be able to describe the key features of the product. So the performance is to occur in the presence of a product and a customer. These are the conditions that will influence the nature of performance. Given a bicycle in a flat street, be able to ride the bike to the end and back. The conditions that will influence the performance are the bike and the flat street. So that's the condition part of your objective. Lastly, the third part is the criterion part. The criterion is a description of the criteria for acceptance of performance. We have to know when performance is sufficient, when someone has mastered the objective. In other words, how well must it be done? To what level must it be done to satisfy the objective? So stating the criterion lets learners know how well they have to perform to be considered competent. In addition, it provides a standard against which to test the success of the instruction and gives you a way of evaluating whether or not the learners can do what you set out to teach them. So the criteria you specify should be what you consider to be the desired or appropriate level of performance, not necessarily a minimum. For example, in some cases I could say a person stitching up clothes, a certain amount of error might be acceptable. However, if I'm talking about a doctor stitching up a person, no error is acceptable. So you have to be able to impose the criteria that are important to that particular situation. Okay. So, for instance, here's an example of an objective with criteria. Given a computer with word processing software, be able to write a simple letter. There should be no spelling, grammar, or punctuation errors. So the criteria are that there should be no errors in the final letter. Okay, so we can define criteria as a function of speed and or accuracy. So speed is providing a time limit. So if time's important, that needs to be part of the objective. If not, you don't put a time limit on it. Like in under 2 hours, within 15 minutes, before midnight, that sort of thing, to the nearest whole number. So here's an example of an objective containing all three components. Students will tell the time represented on an analog clock to the nearest minute. Okay, so that seems pretty simple. So tell the time represents the performance, analog clock represents the condition, and to the nearest minute represents the criterion. So a poorly written objective about the same topic, what if I just said the students will know how to tell time? So you can kind of see the difference there, where we have a written objective, an effective objective. Okay, so what you're going to do, procedures for writing your objectives. Okay, you're going to review the learning map you produced last week. Okay, you're going to list the target behaviors. Then you're going to decide on an action, assessment method, and performance level to demonstrate the first behavior. And then you're going to create the objective statement, and then you're going to go back to your learning map and do it for the second target behavior. So you're going to have several objectives for each one of your learning goals. Okay. So some things to keep in mind when you're doing this, you need to consider that your objectives are related to intended outcomes, okay, rather than the process for achieving those outcomes. So what this means is that teaching and lecturing is part of the process of instruction, but it isn't the purpose of instruction. The purpose is to facilitate learning. So when you're writing objectives, make sure you're describing the intended results and not the process. For instance, you wouldn't say something like, to provide a lecture on Renaissance painters. Okay, that's more of a instruction sort of thing. Okay, you want to be specific versus general. You don't want to make fuzzy statements like understand energy. Okay, know the president. Be able to think clearly. Because those aren't going to help you later on develop your program. If you say something like tie a shoe, assemble a bicycle, shake hands when greeting new customers, those are specific, okay? You can determine when someone has met that objective, okay? So measurable versus unmeasurable, okay? These measurable objectives have outcomes that can be observed. For instance, I say tie a shoe, it's measurable. I can watch somebody tie a shoe and determine they've met that objective versus understand energy. Okay, how would we know if someone understood the concept of energy? Okay, so then we have students versus instructors. Okay, so instructional objectives should describe the student's performance rather than the instructor's performance. If I said something like, teach the importance of washing one's hands, arrange instructional activities, that relates to the instructor and what they're doing. I need to state that as far as the student's performance. Things like be able to write a resume, add 2 digits together, okay, that sort of thing. It has to be directed at the student, not at the instructor. So in conclusion, after generating a list of objectives, you're going to be ready to move to the next phase of the process. Okay, but it's important to begin with determining the objectives and then decide on these activities, not the other way around. In other words, we have to have the objectives before we design our actual learning and our assessments. So in summary, to prepare well-written objectives, make sure you answer these questions. What do I want students to be able to do? What are the important conditions or constraints under which I want them to perform? How well must students perform for me to be satisfied? So for the project, you're going to go ahead and write your objectives. So using all this information we gathered up to this point, and you've generated a lot of information in your analysis if you think about it, we're now going to write the objectives describing exactly what it is you want your learners to be able to do when they finish your instruction. Okay, so to begin, write down your original goal statement. Okay, then write down each one of your goal steps, sub-steps, and subordinate skills in order. Okay, we're not going to worry about the entry behaviors, so don't worry about that. So then beneath each one of your steps, sub-steps, or skills, you're going to answer the following questions. What behavior or performance is expected of the learner? In other words, precisely what should the learner be able to do? Then you're going to ask, what are the conditions that will prevail while the learner is attempting to accomplish the goal? Then you're going to ask, what are the criteria that will be used to determine if the learner has achieved the goal? So after answering these questions, you have the information to write your performance objective for each step, sub-step, and subordinate skill, but not entry behaviors. Okay, so each objective has to have these three components: the performance, the conditions, and the criterion. But if you answer these three questions effectively, then you'll be able to just pull that information and put it together to write your objective. Okay, and when you do that, you have your map. You may want to number those, and there's an example in the handout for this week that shows you how you number your steps, and then you number your objectives, so you can kind of match those up a little bit better. I hope that you find this kind of all coming together and making more sense at this point. After this, we'll be a lot more hands-on. We're going to be developing the assessment and the instruction. So I think that should be really interesting to see how that turns out after all this analysis we've done. Thank you.